Hello, my name is Valerie Tate, and I am an agronomy specialist in North Central Missouri and a member of the planning committee for the Missouri Livestock Symposium. We are so glad that you could join us for our virtual event this evening. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Cynthia Wolf with us, and she's going to talk to us about how to make your lambs thrive to market the most lambs. You can also view some pre-recorded sessions, including one from Dr. Wolf, on our Facebook page or our MissouriLivestock.com webpage. And so you can stay up to date with all the things that are happening there. Dr. Wolf is a doctor of veterinary medicine who taught small ruminant veterinary medicine and production at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine for 38 years. She now works as a solo veterinary practitioner and raises sheep, goats, and beef cattle with her family in Southeast Minnesota. We are so glad that you could join us today. Welcome, Dr. Wolf. Are you ready? You can begin sharing your screen as soon as you are ready.
Okay. All right, I'm ready. How's that, Valerie? Good?
It looks great. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, as we know, the world has changed. I so much prefer to meet you all in person, and maybe that will happen another time. The same as all of you. I'm a sheep producer. That's what we primarily raise, but we do run a cow-calf operation, and then my goat numbers have been growing, not getting too much help from the rest of my family there, but as you all are experiencing, I'm sure the demand for goats is just seems to keep exploding, and I'm not sure that I know where the end is. Anyway, this is picture from our farm. This is what it would look like today. Actually, on the left-hand side, the ewes are now all back in one group, and they do have to get supplemented because you can see we're not as lucky as you, and we do get our forage buried in snow. But we do try to be a grass-based operation and have some challenges, same as you do with forage-based operations and the things that come along with that with sheep, meaning predators and parasites. Anyway, so just moving along, this would be the biggest group of sheep that we lamb is in May and early June. And as you can see, the grass is way mature, not the same nutritional value if something had run across it once already. Okay, so just what are we going to address? We're going to talk mostly from a health standpoint, but we'll talk about how to get more lambs out of your ewes and how to keep them alive, ideally to get them to market or however you sell yours. Let's see now if I am not sure why I am having troubles advancing, but I think Valerie's still on, so. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Just, all right.
Always helps to press the right button, right? Anyway, so this is just kind of how I thought about things for tonight, is keeping our ewe flock well fed, not overfeeding, but keeping them just kind of right, which for me is a body condition score of 3 on a 1 to 5 scale. And we have it a little trickier than you do maybe from time to time, in that we can really burn a lot of calories in the winter. But if you outwinter your ewes, I'm sure you appreciate how many more calories they need just to keep that body condition. And really, as you get close to lambing, which I'm sure some of you are, and some of you maybe are already lambing, and some of you are more sensible than I am, and you're gonna have all your lambs come in the spring. But I want to see this ewe not only maintain condition, but I want to see not only her belly get big, but I want to see her udder get really big in that last 2 to 3 weeks before she gives birth. I try not to pull lambs anymore. Why? Because as we try to grow our ewe numbers, then we try to make sure the sheep do all the work. And if we assist them, then we kind of mask what's a ewe that is able to handle what she should handle in front of nature. So if we needed to pull lambs, I'd like to say we kept a record that we needed to do that and contemplated, was that her fault? Was that how we've cared for her, or was that just luck? And as you know, sometimes on farms we have good luck and bad luck. So those are all things to think about. Then let's just go along and we'll talk about some of these other areas as we go along. First of all, I am a big believer that no matter what time of year you breed, that you should flush those ewes. You know, whether you've got some saved beautiful pasture that, or even a hay field that you're not going to take another crop off of, that's really good feed for those ewes. And you don't have to go out there if you want to be a forage-based operation. You don't have to go out and give them grain, but get them on an improved plane of nutrition based on really, really good feed. And I'm not necessarily saying anything about this particular picture that way. It's actually a picture that a friend of mine from Kansas sent me, and I don't really know anything about irrigated pastures. You can see they do some irrigation there. But think about, well, what date do you want to put those rams in, get those ewes all in the right plane of nutrition, all in the right body condition, and plan for that start at least no less than 2 weeks, but at least start thinking about it more like 6 weeks ahead of breeding. The same for the rams. Like, it drives me crazy when I go to farms and somebody's got their rams that they're going to use locked up because they don't want them to escape and breed out of the time frame that they want to have lambs. But these rams are getting no exercise. They're just standing there eating, wishing they could escape, and that's all they do, minute after minute. And they're not physically fit. And so I'm a big believer that rams should get plenty of exercise before breeding, so that they don't get tired, they don't get overheated, that kind of thing during the breeding season. So those rams need to be in good body condition score too. And we also expect a really sound working ram to lose weight during breeding. Year round, we should feed trace mineral iodized salt. If you come to our farm, you can tell we're not always keeping up with the salt demands, because our sheep like to lick whatever vehicle gets close enough to them to lick. And so that's feedback for me that we're not doing a good enough job. What trace minerals are really important? Selenium's really important, depending how much green forage you have. Sorry, it's not a trace mineral, but vitamin E is really important. Zinc is really important for immune systems. And then iodine is super important. So we don't cut corners and have lambs born that have goiters. One, they can be hard to fit out the birth canal, but secondly, they have a really hard time growing normally and staying the right body temperature. They tend to cool down, especially in my climate. So don't cut corners on feeding your trace mineralized iodized salt. Okay, now a lot of us keep records, but some of us, including me, doesn't do as good a job using those records as we should. And so now that I've sort of hammered down on myself and said, I'm going to look at these and use these records more often, I found I was keeping some sheep that really didn't produce me very nice lambs at weaning. And those ewes, if you looked at them, they looked pretty nice. But that's because they never worked very hard lactation wise, so they never lost a lot of weight. And so that's why they look nice. And by keeping records, I found those ewes. And so they tended to give me singles. They tended to not even hit the average weaning weight. And they were just girls that needed to get wheels under them and go to the sale barn and not be in our flock anymore. So keeping records, it's real easy ahead of lambing to not keep records of ewes that aborted or ewes that ultrasounded pregnant but didn't lamb. Don't forget about them. They need to either be bred back or they need to go. Then we all are pretty good about keeping records of lambs birth to weaning, and that's great, except that if you have a ewe that's lost lambs, even if it was just one lamb out of a litter of 2 or 3, and she lost a lamb 2 out of 3 years, she has too many strikes against her, and again, she's not necessarily profitable. So again, she could go to somebody who needs their yard mowed, but she's not necessarily going to be a good sheep in your flock. And then keep track of your deaths weaning to market. I know veterinarians have gotten very expensive. I'm kind of glad I am where I am in my career, because I would otherwise want to try to wrestle that one to the ground and I would lose. So we don't always know why these lambs die after weaning. And it can be hard to tell with the naked eye. Some veterinarians will work with you, like doing FaceTime necropsy, where you open it up and are videoing the veterinarian to look at a set of tissues to try to determine why did that lamb die after weaning but before marketing. And I've got some pictures in here that I'll share with you because there are some fairly common causes. And so we had a saying when I was a young veterinary student, a long time ago now, that when you hear hoofbeats, think horses and not zebras. And that's the way sheep diseases and sheep health goes as well. We have some common things that kill our lambs. And so we need to kind of, do the best we can guesstimating them and see what kind of management changes could we make to have less mortality. This is kind of a funny story here. I actually, 2 Februaries ago, we had a terrible blizzard here, and I was fortunate enough to actually not be in Minnesota. I was in Southern England for a small ruminant meeting. And I decided that in this little town where we were going to hold this meeting, that I would walk from the train station to the hotel. And I came walking by this field of nice black-faced lambs, and you can see them in the distance. They have a little creep feeder there as well. And the farmer, I could so relate to him. He had just pulled up and found a dead lamb and put it in the back of his truck. And I'm sure he was trying to drive away as fast as I came walking up, because he didn't know that I was a fellow sheep producer and a veterinarian, and I know that with birth comes death. And so he was trying to get that critter gone before any Joe Public saw it. Anyway, so we not only need to take care of the pregnant ewes well, so they have vigorous lambs and they have plenty of colostrum, but they also need to be born in a decent environment. So lambs, as you know, don't necessarily need it to be 60 degrees. In fact, I think they do better, cooler, above freezing for sure. They certainly need plenty of air. There are sheep that do show us how susceptible sheep's respiratory tracts are to getting pneumonia when they don't have good ventilation and when they don't have a dry bedding pack in their environment. And they need to have plenty of colostrum. I like to, if I need to check a ewe's udder, I like to barely have to squeeze on the teat and have something flowing out rather than have to work at getting it to flow. So this is our setup. You can see that in this building, we don't have anything fancy. And these are composite terminal sires, not meaning to make excuses, but you can see they're not having the highest lambing rate, those 2 ewes. Here's my neighbor's barn. It's a beautiful barn. It can really ventilate quite well because he's got these curtains that can go up and down or partway down. He made it very easy, very people friendly to feed his sheep. He didn't have to get in there and have them beat up on his knees and his legs. And it's really nice because if we stand on this feed alley, we can see really well back into these pens. He also is of an age where he said, well, I might as well put everything in the one building. He doesn't have a large number of sheep yet. And so he put his handling facility in here. And so he can easily keep up with management procedures. Here's a frustrated ram. He has a little bit bigger pen, but you can tell what he's thinking. He wants to escape. Okay, so this is many decades ago, and what we used to do when we lambed in April, we called that lambing on pasture, but you can see how little real grass growth we have in April, is we would literally tip this ewe that had just lambed up, and we would strip that little plug out of her teat so then colostrum would flow, stick this lamb's mouth on that teat and tickle its tail right here like its mother does. I call that the go button. And when I used to teach veterinary students, I think they really were looking for a literal go button. Anyway, we just mimic what the ewe does, is tickle that tail, and those lambs just drink colostrum until your muscles are aching and you've decided they've had enough. And then we let that ewe up, pick the lamb up, and I apologize, I did not put a picture in, but I cut the umbilical cord off about as long as my thumb, and then I dip it in a combination of rubbing alcohol and 7% iodine. And I know with all the black drug market and manufacturing that's goes on in the US, it gets hard to get strong iodine. I don't know exactly why in the world that would be a good thing in making crystal meth, but that's what I'm told. And so if you can't get strong iodine, just get whatever's the strongest iodine that you can, and then go to your drugstore and get rubbing alcohol, which is ethyl alcohol, and put those into a bottle roughly 50-50 and cut those umbilical cords and dip them, and they'll dry faster than anything else you've ever dipped them in. I didn't make that up. I was taught that a couple years ago, and it was really important to me because one of the things that I fight in our lambs are joint infections, and I was going to talk about that a little bit. But anyway, I like to get those umbilical cords where they're not serving as wicks and taking sort of environmental bacteria up into the body of the lamb and then into the bloodstream and then to the joints or even the lungs or the kidneys. So just please don't underestimate how well we need those ewes to eat so they can make plenty of colostrum, and how darn much colostrum our lambs need to have. And if you feel like that's a problem on your farm, there are good colostrum supplements out there. And if you're like me, you're always trying to find one that does the job, but it's also the cheapest. Well, this is a scenario where you get what you pay for. So if it costs a little more than what you wish it did, remember we're going to divide those 10 calf doses by about 6 to 8 lambs. And so its cost is really pretty small compared to a lamb that doesn't get off to a good start. So you have lambs born. Sometimes you come out in the morning and you go, oh man, I should have just woke up about 3 hours earlier and checked on these ewes. And we find a lamb that looks like it was born alive. Its mother licked it off, but it's dead. And you're really curious, was that lamb born dead? In other words, was it okay to stay asleep in your warm bed having a good dream? Or was it a bad deal that if you had just been there, you could have helped that lamb stay alive? And so I know you're curious, how can you tell? Is those lungs, you cut out a little snip of lungs as big as like your thumbnail, drop it in a cup of water, and it will sink if that lamb never breathed. So it was born dead and never breathed. And then you can rest assured that it really wasn't all your fault. This is a picture that doesn't look like lungs, that look like liver, but this lamb was born dead. So these lungs, if I cut out a little piece and I drop that in a cup of water, it does sink. And some other things I can tell about this lamb is this is its small intestine, and it's empty. There is absolutely no milk in the small intestine of this lamb. This is just what we call fetal waste or meconium that lamb, because it never got colostrum or milk, it didn't start to pass, because this lamb was born dead. It never breathed. It also has some fancy term about the little slippers that it has over its feet in lambs that were born dead and never stood up. And I'm not going to try to say it because I'll just butcher the word, but that'd be a good spelling bee word. Onchium, I think. And so we know that this lamb was born dead. That's more common in litters that are 3 and 4 or 5 size lambs. Okay, let's talk about naval infections that then can become joint infections or could become pneumonia or could become abscesses in the kidneys or the liver. So basically we have this wet navel. We have an environment, whether it's just wet outside on the grass because it rained the night before, or maybe it's a barn that didn't get cleaned out before lambing started, or bedding has gotten expensive, or not as accessible. And so it's just not really dry in there. And what's a lamb dryness test? I would just say to you that if you're lambing through a building, if you kneel down and you come up with a dirty, wet knee, that it's not dry enough for your lambs. The bacteria go up in through this umbilical cord, and they go toward the liver. Like I say, it can go in the bloodstream to the kidneys or even the lungs, or go widespread to the joints. So here's a little lamb that is not looking very happy. And so do we think the knee's big? Yeah, maybe. I also think he's painful on his back legs too. And so the nice thing is, whenever we're lambing, we don't have just one baby lamb, right? We always have multiple baby lambs. And so can we tell for sure this is a big knee? Just go grab a normal lamb and feel the back side of the knee. And if you think there's some swelling back there, it's not very much, but it's very, it's a little subtle, but it's there, and the normal lamb doesn't have it, then it had an umbilical infection that went to its joints. What antibiotics should you use? What should you do, et cetera, et cetera? Boy, I can only tell you a couple things of words of wisdom. One is, the minute you think that lamb walks not normally, isn't up and running and jumping and playing, start thinking about a joint infection. Yes, it might have a mild fever. Definitely, if you feel its limbs, you'll feel the affected joints, and it could be more than one, are a little warmer and a little swollen. And if you were in the United Kingdom, they'd say penicillin should work most of the time, because they're usually a bacteria that's somewhere on your farm that's sensitive to penicillin. I think you kind of got to go trial and error, and if it doesn't get healed, it's probably because we didn't notice it and treat it early enough. So just kind of remember that for the second or third case that you get. So that's my words of wisdom. If it's some superstar lamb, wannabe, then, and you happen to be an MD, or you're a veterinarian, or maybe you're a nurse, I actually have pretty good success with, I give these lambs some injectable tranquilizer, and I actually flush those joints. And I also give them systemic antibiotics, and that's what I have the best luck with. But I can't imagine, taking lambs to a veterinarian, what that might cost. Anyway, this is the inside of a lamb that had an infection from its navel, and you can see it started here and it went to the liver. There's a blood vessel that normally comes out of the navel, and this is an abscess. Here's another abscess in the liver, and this is maybe an abscessed area starting on the lungs. So this isn't a very big or old lamb. You can tell it's a warm enough time of the year that there were already flies. And we see this on pasture when we have a rainstorm of 2 or 3 day duration, that we expect to see some joint infections within the next 5 to 7 days. Okay, let's go back to baby lambs for a minute. Let's say you had a set of twins and you had a really nice lambs at a day of age, but about 2 days of age, you had one lamb that was all slimy and extra saliva around its mouth. It had a wet mouth. That's a watery mouth lamb. That lamb didn't get enough colostrum. It got an E. coli, which is not an uncommon bacteria at all, infection of its intestines, and through its intestines, which caused a toxic situation in its body, and that's why it has the watery mouth. And these lambs, again, they need immediate care, and they may or may not pull through, but look at them as sort of the tip of the iceberg. Say to yourself, I do not want to have more of these. And what you need to recognize is you need to make sure you get more quality colostrum in those lambs at birth. And I didn't try to look really hard for any new research in lambs, but I know more with calves, we're talking now that colostrum needs to get into their little bodies as close to the first 2 hours of life as possible. So again, if lambs were born tonight outside at my house, those lambs would get cold and immobile from the weather because it's about 9 degrees before they ever drank colostrum. So do everything you can to make sure they get good quality colostrum in them as soon as possible. That's my point there. If we open them up, we don't really find a lot of abnormalities inside of them. So just remember to always look at that for that wet mouth. And I do try to treat these. I'm not always successful, and I don't have the patience of a saint. And so I would give them fluids under their skin. I would give them a drug that when it first came out was labeled as Banamine. Now the generics will just call it by its drug name, which is Flunixin. And I would check its temperature, and I'd probably put it in a warm place because it's probably got a low body temperature. So I mentioned that, make sure we get good colostrum into them. And this reminds me of a story. One time I was asked to come to a farm. They were losing a lot of baby goat kids, and there's real similarities between goat kids and baby lambs. And so we went to the farm, and I said, well, could I see your stomach tubes? And they said, well, yeah, except we just threw them all away a couple days ago. Well, the feed salesman is the one who asked me if I'd be able to come up there. And he had been there a couple days before, and he saw these stomach tubes, and he said, oh my goodness, they are just not being kept clean enough. And so he said, you guys, let's just start over. So when I suggest to you that you give lambs extra colostrum, I guess I just want to be sure to say that no matter how you give it, whether it's suckling on its mother, whether you give it with a nipple on a bottle, or whether you tube those lambs, which is what I probably would do, because again, I'm not as patient as I used to be, that you be sure that you rinse those tubes in some sanitizer afterwards and hang them up to dry. And if you're like me, because I don't, how would I say this? One of us in this family is cleaner than the other. I just take a paper clip and open the paper clip up, and I hook that in the rounded edge of the tube where the holes are, and I let those tubes hang upside down to dry. And that way too, I can kind of see if they really were sanitized. And then I mentioned I'm a cheapskate, and I throw them away and start with new tubes with the start of a new lambing season. And if I started to have problems with sickness in baby lambs, I might even throw tubes away and start over with new ones, or designate this tube is only to be used in normal lambs, and this tube could be used in sick lambs, and throw away the lamb. I hope I don't throw them away. Throw away the tube that's used in sick lambs more often. Okay, let's talk a little bit about lamb diarrhea, because I get called sometimes lambs have been dying on the farm, and the history is really, really important, because here's our list of causative bacteria and viruses and even parasites that can cause diarrhea in young lambs. And what's really helpful to me is if you tell me how old those lambs are when they started to have diarrhea, because I put these in a particular order on purpose. E. coli might be making lambs sick at 2-3 days of age. Rotavirus, they're usually more like 5 to 7 days of age. Coronavirus, they could be as old as 2 weeks. I don't see much coronavirus in lambs, but I know it's like a dirty word everywhere else. Salmonella can be whenever. Cryptosporidia is more like a 10+ day old lamb. Luckily, I'm not seeing much of that in lambs anymore. You can have more than one thing cause diarrhea. And then coccidia, usually they're at least a month old. Now, I don't know what your diagnostic lab in the state of Missouri charges you to determine what's causing the diarrhea, but I would check on that if you were having diarrhea problems in your young lambs. And I would make sure, one, I got them plenty of diarrhea. Two, I'd make sure it came from multiple lambs that had not been treated. And I'd want to know what I had going here. And the reason is kind of because how we fix it for the future Depends on what's causing it. Okay, so let's move on. Let's get away from diarrhea. Let's talk about what's the very minimum vaccination we want to give to lambs. And so what I do at home has been a good approach. It works for me. Maybe you have a different approach that's working. And so by all means, if what you're doing is working, don't change it just because I have a different approach. I'm happy for you all to ask me about it when we have questions. But here's what I do. I buy either a 7-way Clostridial vaccine called Covaccinate, or I use Barvac CD&T. There's some other ones out there that are also really good, but they can be a little harder to get a good supply. And ahead of weaning, ideally 2 weeks ahead of weaning, the person would crowd these lambs up. That sounds like work, I know, because it is. And we'd give our appropriate dose. So the dose for sheep is what you give to lambs, is the same dose you give to ewes. You don't change it just because the body's different in size. And we give it under the skin. I give it in the neck ahead of the shoulder. Why? Because I do a lot of direct marketing of retail meat, and I know that the neck is the lowest cost meat that I can raise. Or way low down on the ribs is also really low cost meat too. But the neck is pretty easy to trim if they needed to. We crowd them up pretty tight, whether that's in your chute or that's in a pen, because they're not like people and we can't tell them stay still. This won't hurt if you just stay still. So they aren't going to listen. So keep them pretty snug in there, and it makes really a lot easier to give their vaccination. I apologize, I didn't tell you, but I always use a 5/8 inch needle. You can buy those yourselves now. They come in a box of 100. We typically use 18 gauge needle, but I have clients with small hobby flocks and they kind of feel badly for those lambs, and they like to use a 20 gauge, a smaller needle. But again, it's 5/8 inch long, so it's easy to give it just under the skin, but not hit bone, not hit muscle, and not have it come out the other side of the skin and just give it intra-wool or intra-hair. And then we need to repeat that. And it depends on which vaccine you're using, whether it's 6 weeks later you repeat it or whether it's 3 to 4 weeks later. But it needs to be repeated. And don't shortchange your lambs. Don't shortchange your best of intentions. Be sure you give that booster dose. Okay, now let's say there might be some of you here that have kids in 4-H. There might be some of you who enjoy showing sheep or are in the business of selling breeding stock. And so there's a calf vaccine out there that helps stimulate their immune system. I'm not telling you it's going to give you direct protection against what's in it, but it stimulates the animal's immune system so that if they move to a new farm or they go to a show and they're around, animals from 30 other farms, their immune system is better geared up to deal with the different bacteria and viruses that they might see. And so we take the usual 2 ml calf dose. It has to be mixed up and put into a liquid and used right away. And we divide that into about 3 lambs. And we have to squirt that up the nostril of the lamb to make it be an active vaccine. Okay, just a few little things about management. We could have made a whole talk just on management around raising lambs. I'm a huge believer of using paint brands to label the ewe and lamb family. It makes it much easier to keep track and assess if you think you have problems. So like if you turn out ewes that are raising triplets and they're not all even in size, or you wonder like this ewe is 7 years old, can she really have enough milk to raise all 3 lambs? Then you just label that family and it's easier to keep track of them. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say there. This is a picture out of Pipestone Lamb and Wool Program. And if you guys can just excuse me a minute, I think my cat is going to scratch my door in half. I'll be right back. One thing about house cats is they are definitely in charge of the household. Anyway, and they just take these large, I think they're 6 to 8 inch PVC pipe that are capped on either end. You can see it's capped here, these ones, this one here, and they cut a hole big enough to actually have a used mouth fit in there, and they fill that up with water. And so imagine this is running down through multiple jugs. Okay, so here's one jug, here's another jug, here could be another jug, there could be another jug. And this is the water source for these ewes at lambing time. This doesn't have to be filled up every day because it holds a couple days worth, and it's a real labor saver. There's other ideas people have used, but that's just one that as a veterinarian, I don't love the idea because I wonder what we can spread, but as a labor saving plan, that's really a wonderful idea. And then here's our little couple dollar digital thermometer, and you should have multiple ones when you're lambing, because that's the best way to stay ahead of knowing if you have a sick ewe or a sick lamb, is to check its temperature. Okay, so here I stole, if you will, from the Ontario goat site, and I put this little label on today so you'd know that I knew the difference between a lamb and a kid. But this is their little checklist of how to assess goat kids, and it's so well done that I don't believe it should be reinvented. So I just share that in a slide because I think it's worth actually printing and laminating and putting wherever your lambs are, to remind you these are the things we need to look for to make sure that these lambs really are healthy. Okay, so I don't want to run out of time, so I'm just going to move along a little bit faster. Here's an older lamb. This is after weaning. And so these are these post-weaning lamb conditions that we need to try to avoid. And so basically I have a rule of thumb at home that if I'm pale feeding grain to lambs on feed that are going to end up being what I call lamb chops, that I don't raise their feed level any faster than every 3 to 5 days. And I just read the lambs. In other words, do I have manure that is what sheep manure should be, or is it getting way too ploppy and smells way too much like sour grain? So if you open this lamb up, what do I see? I see what I call this sweet and sour fluid, that if I checked it, its pH would be acidic. That's not good for healthy rumen. And I see a rumen full of a lot of corn. I see a rumen wall that's really unhappy. It's had way too much acid, shocking it from the inside out, and so it's no longer healthy. No wonder sometimes you see these lambs actually develop a perforating ulcer. So I have a lamb that's on feed and it's not wanting to eat. It's looking depressed. And so on those lambs, here's the most common things I think about. And so was it a grain overload? Do we have a history to suggest that? So this lamb actually has a story in that it was on a lady's farm, and she had a nutritional advisor who said, we need to make your ration a little hotter, if you will. We need to make it so these lambs grow a little faster. And so they changed the ration, the new feed came, and there was no discussion about how many pounds these lambs were supposed to get. There was discussion about, we think we can switch to this new feed over the course of a week. And so they did that, but the sheep producer kept feeding the same number of 5-gallon pails. And so this new feed was much denser. It weighed a lot more in that 5-gallon pail than the previous feed. And so basically these lambs had about a 25% increase in grain being fed to them. And that's why this lamb and other lambs had grain overload. So we've got to think about having a scale that we use to weigh what we're feeding, whether it's forage or grain or both. Okay, now let's say this lamb was depressed and standing off by itself and not wanting to eat. is if this lamb acts like it has some disconnection from the world, like maybe it's looking up at the sky, maybe it's pushing its forehead against the wall or the fence, but it just seems like it's not connected to its environment. Think about what we call polio or polioencephalomalacia. And basically what happened was all the nice healthy rumen bacteria in here got insulted by the grain. The lamb didn't have a visible acidosis or grain overload, but we stopped making normal amounts of thiamine in the rumen. And so the lamb's neurologic system, or its brain specifically, is the most sensitive tissue to thiamine. And so the lamb starts having parts of its brain actually get soft. And that's why they just are tuned out, if you will. And so if you feed your lambs grain, or you're a really good pasture manager and they're on some lush pasture, a bottle of B complex or a bottle of thiamine is something you should always have around your place. And when in doubt, because it's a water soluble vitamin, you should give them some thiamine or B complex and treat them ideally twice a day. And in 3 days, they're going to be better, if not better in 24 hours, to be honest. Okay, and lastly, what else could we have? We could have a disease that we can easily vaccinate against. And in my earlier slide, I mentioned that we should. So in my slang of vaccinating with CD&T, one of those is type D, Clostridium perfringens type D. And any lamb, again, on lush pasture or on grain should be well vaccinated against this, because it's really a tough one to treat them for. Usually they're sick for a couple hours before they die. Usually we have a couple die in a couple day period. And you're saying, darn, what should I have done differently? And that's what we need to do, is vaccinate them. Okay, so there's a picture of how purple their intestines can get with Clostridial infections. All right, now let's look at coccidia. And this slide was really fun that I took off the internet from a British veterinary clinic. But we're all have lambs that are at risk for coccidia, and I need to really watch my time here, sorry. But I imagine you guys can access this. So again, coccidia can be a lamb disease, whether it's a pasture kept lamb or whether it's a confinement reared lamb. It can affect really young lambs. I only see that actually in confinement. It's more likely a couple month old lamb that's not growing well. And here's a picture of how dark brown the diarrhea can be. There can even be blood in it. That lamb's not been thriving. They get dehydrated. Got to jump right on those and then scratch your head and say, how am I going to prevent it? And I didn't mean to run out of time. So there's some coccidia stats we could put out there. But one thing I want to share with you is if you're using a watering system in your pasture and it's periodically making little puddles because it's overflowing from time to time, you need to really address that. Those are great places to get coccidia to be in high numbers and infect our lambs. Okay, so we've got some control, we've got some treatment options. And then I'm kind of love my little video I made years ago. The other thing we can have is barber pole worm. And so here's the inside of the abomasum. And those are millions of barber pole worms moving in the fluid that's inside the abomasum. So it has to be a grazing lamb. It should have green colored contents inside its abomasum. Instead, these are coffee ground color because of all the blood that's being sucked and released into them. And those are kind of an emergency. They need TLC. And again, I ran out of time, but I'll go for another few minutes and we'll take 10 minutes of questions. Yeah, I got about 4.
Please go. Please continue.
Thank you. So this is kind of a neat slide from Down Under. And it shows you that the percent of larvae, of the barber pole larvae that survive over time at various temperatures. So it's from Down Under. So let's pick kind of this temperature range because that's probably where you guys are in the grazing time. And so we'll look at the green colored one. And you can see that the larval numbers really drop off down at about 2 months of rest time off of that pasture. So this is kind of counter to how tall a forage can get. But on the other hand, it's really important that we aren't giving massive doses of infective barber pole larvae to our lambs by coming back and grazing too early. So that's just food for thought if you're having troubles with your barber pole approach. The other thing that a lot of us can do is figure out whether it's cows or whether it's horses, what else can we use to vacuum sheep worm larvae off our pasture? And so there's things we just have to think outside the box and do things differently than how we used to. Okay, that's kind of an embarrassment right here, right? We shouldn't have those little scars on your pasture. I mean, it'll come back. It's a well-established sod, but clearly the cows that were there were ready to be moved, and it's a good thing they're off of there. Okay, now don't keep treating all your lambs. Only treat the lambs that need it. So here's an anemic, it happens to be a goat, but we'll pretend it's a lamb. Look at the condition. Are they thriving, or do you have some that are really lagging behind? Those are ones that might need treating. Ideally, they're pelleted all the time. And then we all get slips back from the auction barn when we sell lambs and sell ewes, but a scale that weighs your animals at home is really worth investing in, so that when you do need to dose them, you're treating them for the right dose. They did a study a long time ago in New Zealand, and I think of New Zealand as the land of sheep farming, and they found that sheep producers in New Zealand underestimated the weight of their sheep by about 20%. So they would have been effectively underdosing them. So use the scale as much as you can. Now, this is not my husband's favorite slide, but if we look at this, we should be using 3 different dewormers together if we have resistance on our farm, because we have a lot more better effectiveness than if we only used one. So this is a different drug to this one, to this one. This is a 2-way combination, and here's a 3-way combination. Okay, now here's the part my husband really dislikes, is he says there's no way he's going to give these separately. And so if you have a small flock, what you would want to do is just have your 3 different dewormers set in open-faced cups, and you draw up the amounts you need for the animals you needed to give it in that dosing syringe. So you are kind of giving them separately because you're drawing up the right amount and putting it right in that syringe, but you're only putting that in that lamb's mouth as 1 dose. So it's labor intensive, but not as bad as if we had to squeeze that 3 times. Just to make sure you're all aware, there's a great website on worm control. Excuse me, that's my border collie burping, not me, called wormx.info. And there's so much good information there. And so I would suggest keeping abreast of what they post on that website. Okay. Genetic selection for parasite resistance, it can be done. It's not something you accomplish in a year, but certainly something to be considering. Okay, what other things kill lambs that we didn't talk about that I'll touch on? One would be urinary blockage. Another would be a mistake in your feed, or if you do a lot of fertilizing over time with maybe some pig manure. Or if we use copper boluses year after year in our mature animals, we might start to see a toxicity. Don't know if you guys have liver flukes. Okay, so let me go on to this, and then I'll call it time for some questions. This is the urethra of a male lamb, and these are all little stones that formed in the kidneys and tried to be passed, and obviously weren't able to be passed. And this lamb died of kidney failure, or water belly is another name for it. This is a bladder from a different animal. And again, we have a whole bunch of stones, and the stone type is largely driven by what that animal is eating. So we'll see if we can talk about some questions now, because I think I've talked long enough. So let me see, am I supposed to look in the chat, or just do our questions.
So yeah, so I encourage people to type questions in the chat. As you were speaking, I didn't see any unless they sent them directly to you. No one sent the a question to me. But if someone has a question, they can unmute and ask questions now. We appreciate you provided some really great information. I'm a beef cattle producer, and I gleaned some pretty useful tips there too. I think the navel of a beef calf is probably pretty sensitive as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. That's a good point. And like for us, we calve in May and June, so it's going to get wet, and not every mother cow appreciates a calf being tagged. But those of us calving on pasture, we know if we're going to tag them, we're going to have to do it in those first couple hours. So it'd be super easy to dip those navels at the same time.
Yes, that's a good idea. I appreciate that. So does anyone have a question for Dr. Wolf?
You all are going to make me feel bad if you don't have any questions.
Thank you. I learned a ton. I don't have sheep or goats yet, but I'm planning on it. And I've gone to Moses conference and, done a lot of workshops, but I'm wondering, have you heard of silvopasture, and what do you think about it?
I have heard of it. I'm not a pro, and I don't know if my husband's actually inside yet, but that's like a combination of forest land and pasture. Is that right?
Yeah. Like they apparently feed willow, and that's supposed to make the rumen not real happy place for some of the
Uh-oh, Zephyr, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Apparently they either, feed it or let them go in where there's willow. And that's supposed to make, before they put them on a really rich pasture, and that's supposed to make the rumen not very good place for parasites.
Okay.
I don't know. Steve Gabriel has a book on it.
I'll look at that. One thing I would say is if you're having troubles getting your sheep to eat something that you want them to eat, besides kind of, making the paddock smaller with portable electric fence, we would also sprinkle mineral. So we live in an area that's had floods, which seems to had been good at distributing thistle. And so we would sprinkle mineral on some of the worst thistle areas when the thistle's young to get them to eat it down. So if they don't, I'm not aware how well sheep like willow. I think cows like willows. So that would be very interesting. The other thing that is pumpkins. The tannins, I think that's what it is. And pumpkins can be pretty unfriendly to parasites as well.
Groovy.
Yeah.
That's great.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Anyone have other questions for Dr. Wolf? All right. Well, I'll give everyone a minute yet to think about a question if they have one, or to be brave enough to ask it. Remind everyone that you can see the recordings of the Livestock Symposium virtual events on our Facebook page or the website, MissouriLivestock.com, and you can view those and see what's coming up as well. We have several pre-recorded events on there, as well as a couple live events that were recorded and are on there. I know that later in February, Jim Garish is going to be one of our speakers. And so if anyone has a question, here's your last chance to ask it. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Wolf. That was some great information. We really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to spend with us and provide us some great information about how to help those lambs thrive. Thank you.
Thank you.